The entire restaurant went silent the moment his laughter echoed across the room. A billionaire, dripping in arrogance and designer clothes, leaned back in his chair as if the world itself existed only to entertain him. He had just mocked a waitress, a young black woman whose only crime was speaking with an accent while taking his order. He exaggerated her words, twisting them into a cruel joke, and his wealthy friends roared with laughter. But she didn't flinch. She didn't argue, or shout or storm away. No, her eyes held steady, calm but sharp, like a storm brewing behind glass. The billionaire smirked, certain he had crushed her spirit. What he didn't know was that this quiet woman carried a power he couldn't even imagine. Because in just a few moments in front of every single person watching, she would turn his mockery into the most humiliating moment of his life. With a single sentence, she would silence the laughter, flip the power in the room, and leave the billionaire stunned and speechless. What happened next wasn't just revenge. It was a lesson he would never forget. It was a Friday evening at one of the city's most upscale restaurants, the kind of place where crystal chandeliers glowed like diamonds and the smell of truffle. Butter seemed to linger in the air. The tables were filled with executives, lawyers, and wealthy families celebrating success. At the center of it all sat Richard Harland, a billionaire real estate mogul known as much for his money as for his arrogance. With his slicked-back hair and smug grin, Richard held court at a long table surrounded by colleagues who laughed at every word he spoke, no matter how cruel. To him, the staff weren't people, they were props. And tonight, he had found his target. Her name was Maya. She was 28, working double shifts to save for her master's degree, her natural grace and warmth shining through even in the fast pace of service. When she approached Richard's table, tray balanced effortlessly in her hands. Her voice carried the hint of her mother's homeland, an accent that told a story of roots deeper than this polished dining room could ever hold. But to Richard, it was an invitation to mock. He twisted her words, exaggerating syllables like a child imitating nonsense, and his companions erupted with laughter. Maya didn't respond. She lowered her gaze for a moment, her lips pressed tight, then offered a polite smile. It wasn't weakness. It was patience, like someone who had weathered storms before. No one else noticed the way her shoulders straightened, the way her eyes sharpened, as if waiting for the right moment. Richard thought he had embarrassed her. He had no idea that the woman standing before him was about to shatter his pride with a revelation he could never have seen coming. Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling the deep red wine in his glass as though the world owed him entertainment, and his eyes followed Maya as she carefully placed the plates in front of his party. "Careful there," he sneered, dragging out the vowels, mimicking the lilt of her accent as though it were some sort of circus act. "Wouldn't want you to drop the chicken," he said, deliberately mispronouncing the word in an exaggerated imitation that sent the entire table bursting into laughter. Forks clinked against plates, and a few of his friends covered their mouths as they tried, and failed, to hide their amusement. Maya's cheeks flushed, but she didn't falter. She placed the next dish on the table, her hands steady, her movements graceful, her silence louder than any argument. Richard smirked, mistaking her composure for submission. "Tell me, sweetheart," he continued, his voice booming just loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Where are you from, really? Somewhere out in the sticks? Or maybe you just picked that accent up from TV?" The laughter rose again, this time joined by a few uncomfortable glances from diners nearby, people who weren't brave enough to interfere, but weren't heartless, enough not to feel the sting of humiliation on her behalf. Maya's eyes flicked up, meeting his for just a second, and in that tiny flash of steel was something that didn't match the softness of her uniform or the humility of her role. It was strength, coiled tight like a spring. Richard missed it, too busy gloating, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To the wonders of America," he announced grandly, where even the help tries their best to sound educated. The words sliced through the air, drawing a collective gasp from one corner of the room. A young couple at a nearby table exchanged looks of disgust. An older gentleman shook his head and muttered under his breath, though too quietly for Richard to hear. Maya simply shifted her weight, straightened her back, and gave the slightest smile. Not the smile of someone defeated, but the kind that suggested she knew something Richard didn't. She cleared the last empty plate, her voice calm, professional when she asked if they would need anything else. The contrast between her composure and his cruelty was stark, almost jarring. One of Richard's friends nudged him, whispering something about going too far, but Richard only chuckled and waved him off, eager to continue his performance. "Oh, don't worry," he said loudly, locking eyes with Maya again. "I'm sure she'll understand if we keep things simple. Tiny words, slow speech." His table erupted once more, their laughter spilling out across the restaurant like poison, tainting the air. But somewhere beneath the humiliation, beneath the polished calm, there was a flicker in Maya's eyes, something unshakable, something dangerous. She didn't snap back, didn't break her silence, didn't grant him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. No. She simply turned, her tray balanced effortlessly, and walked away with a grace that made his cruelty look cheap. And in that silence, in that unbroken poise, lay the promise of a storm he would never see coming. Richard wasn't finished. In fact, Maya's calmness seemed to fuel his cruelty, as though her refusal to crack was a personal challenge he couldn't walk away from. When she returned to check on the table, he leaned forward, his elbows pressing into the white linen, his grin wide and predatory. "Ah, there she is," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Our star waitress. Tell me, darling, how do you say bottle of wine in your whatever language it is?" He twisted his tongue in mock gibberish, babbling nonsense syllables until his companions roared with laughter again, nearly choking on their food. Maya stood still, her notepad poised, her expression neutral, but her eyes were fixed on him with a quiet intensity that unsettled the diners at nearby tables. "Do you even understand me?" Richard continued, cocking his head, feigning exaggerated patience. "Blink twice if you're lost, sweetheart." A ripple of discomfort spread through the restaurant. People were beginning to shift in their seats, waiters whispered at the edge of the room, and the manager peered nervously from behind the bar. Richard was too arrogant to notice, too caught up in his performance. "You know," he said, lowering his voice into something meant to sound charming but dripping with malice, "it's a shame, really. Such a pretty face, but no one will ever take you seriously with that accent. You'll be pouring drinks your whole life." This time, the laughter that followed was thinner, less confident, but still cruel. Maya inhaled slowly, the only sign that his words had even grazed her. She set a bottle of Merlot on the table, her hands steady, and for the first time she spoke. Not much, just a polite correction when Richard deliberately misnamed the wine. Her pronunciation was precise, her tone refined, and though it was only a single sentence, it caught a few people off guard. A woman at a nearby table raised her brows, exchanging a look with her husband, as if realizing there was more to this waitress than met the eye. Richard chuckled, brushing it off, but for the briefest moment, a flicker of irritation crossed his face. He didn't like being contradicted, not even on something small. And now, with the restaurant's attention subtly shifting, he felt the need to double down. He raised his glass high again, calling out to the room like a performer on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "I think our waitress should give us a little show. Maybe she can teach us how to say something simple in her language, if she even knows it well enough." A few of his companions laughed, but others glanced around nervously. The tension in the room was growing thicker by the second. Maya said nothing, her silence sharper than any insult. And in that silence lay the tiniest hint of a smile, as though she knew his arrogance had just walked itself into a trap. The laughter at Richard's table lingered like smoke, filling the room with discomfort. But Maya didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands resting calmly against the tray at her side, her eyes locked on Richard with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to reveal. For the first time that evening, she spoke at length, not in English, but in flawless, fluid Mandarin Chinese. The words rolled off her tongue with elegance, crisp and confident, each syllable precise, carrying the cadence of someone who had lived and breathed the language for years. The restaurant froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks clattered onto plates, and Richard's laughter died in his throat, his smirk collapsing into stunned silence. Maya's voice rose slightly, addressing not just Richard but the entire table, her Chinese clear and commanding, as though she were delivering a lecture rather than waiting on them. And then, with perfect timing, she switched back to English, her tone even, professional but cutting like glass. "I speak 3 languages, sir, but respect is one that doesn't need translation." A ripple of gasps swept across the dining room, followed by a murmur of approval from tables that had silently endured Richard's cruelty. His friends glanced at one another uneasily, their laughter gone, some shifting in their seats as if ashamed to be associated with him. Richard's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening but no words coming out, his arrogance cracking in real time. For the first time all night, the balance of power shifted, and it shifted hard. The room was no longer laughing with him. It was waiting for her. The silence that followed was crushing, but Maya wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving Richard's as she continued, this time in English, her voice calm yet powerful. "Funny thing," she said, her words deliberate. "You own buildings, but I own languages. And unlike real estate, no one can ever take that from me." A stunned murmur rippled across the restaurant, but then she delivered the blow that shattered Richard's last shred of arrogance. "And since you enjoy mocking the staff so much," she added, straightening with quiet dignity, "you should know this waitress isn't on your payroll. I'm here shadowing my family's investment, the very group negotiating the purchase of this restaurant chain, which, in case you didn't know, includes the hotel you just bought last spring." Gasps echoed through the room as Richard's eyes widened, the color draining from his face. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had laughed at a woman who not only outclassed them, but held more influence than they dared imagine. Maya turned smoothly, her tray balanced effortlessly, and walked away as the diners broke into soft applause. Richard sat frozen, humiliated, crushed beneath the weight of a truth he could never laugh away. The applause swelled until it filled every corner of the restaurant, a quiet rebellion against arrogance, a celebration of dignity reclaimed. Maya didn't linger to bask in it. She simply carried on with her work, shoulders straight, her calm presence now radiating a strength everyone could feel. Richard, however, sat in the wreckage of his pride, his once booming laughter silenced, his face burning as his colleagues avoided his gaze. The man who thought he owned the room had been stripped of every ounce of power, undone not by wealth or status, but by the very humility he tried to mock. In that moment, the lesson hung heavier than any humiliation. Accents are not flaws. They are living proof of journeys, of cultures, of resilience. They are reminders that the world is bigger than one man's ego. As Maya disappeared into the kitchen, the applause faded into an almost reverent hush, and people returned to their meals with a newfound respect for the woman who had turned cruelty into triumph. And Richard? He would remember this night not as another evening of dominance, but as the night a waitress reminded him, and everyone watching, that respect speaks louder than money, and kindness always outranks arrogance. if you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps more people see these videos. And if you've ever dealt with someone arrogant, entitled, or just plain disrespectful, drop your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. Make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next Karen meltdown, courtroom twist, or shocking HOA showdown. Trust me, the stories coming up are even wilder than this one.